Good morning, everyone, and happy Friday, one and all. It's been a long week for many of us, and we're all ready to move on. You could say that about this year as well, let's be honest. This is the Quad City Chamber's mid-year economic forecast, and I know that you've been a part of other economic forecasts in the past, but wow, we really need it now to figure out how we're going to chart our way through this pandemic. And we hope that most of you, if not all of you, are doing so much better for your business in this year. So many things have reopened, and that's just excellent news for all of us. So welcome to the Quad City Chamber's 2021 Mid-Year Economic Update. It's presented by IMEG Corporation as well as Mediacom Business. Now, the past year has certainly been an interesting one. Let's be honest about that. And it seems that we are getting back to at least some sense of normalcy. And the information shared at today's event should help you and your business plan for the future. So we'll learn about various factors and trends affecting our economy as we continue to work through and stabilize the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. And on behalf of the Quad Cities Chamber, thank you for everything you and your businesses have done to adapt and to change, to be flexible, innovate, and perhaps even more importantly, we have seen time and time again how you have helped your fellow businessmen and women sticking together and getting through this. And it has been really inspiring to see how so many businesses did adapt and made sure that not only they survived, but other people thrived as well. So as your go-to resource for business, the Chamber continues to try to provide access to financial resources, business intelligence and new trends, promotions, as well as, of course, always trying to be an advocate for you. Now, I'd like to take an opportunity to thank all of our sponsors. Over the year, the Chamber has had to change most of its events, yet we've still been able to bring you a lot of the information that you need to know, due in part to the flexibility and the support of these sponsors as well. So I thank you to our co-sponsors, the presenting sponsors today, IMEG and Mediacom Business. Thank you very much. The information that we're providing today is invaluable, and it's thanks to you that we're able to do it. At this time, we want to share a message from our co-presenting sponsor, Mediacom Business, which provides innovative broadband products that match the diverse telecommunications needs of public and private sector clients, offering the business sector a trusted source for fast and reliable broadband services. They combine a robust network of, get this, 600,000 strand miles of fiber optic cable with an experienced and professional team of engineers. Mediacom Business is perfectly positioned to meet the voice and the high-speed internet requirements of any size business. We also would like to thank and recognize our gold sponsors today. They include AM General LLC, Quad City Bank and Trust, RSM, TAG, the Family Credit Union, and our event is powered by D Films. The crew here got here at the crack of dawn to make sure that we were all prepared. And thank you again to IMEG as our co-presenting sponsor. Headquartered in the Quad Cities, IMEG is a leading U.S.-based engineering design and consulting firm that delivers really kind of a rare combination: the broad expertise of a national leader with the personal relationships and deep collaborations of a local firm. Just exactly what you want to see. IMEG is 100% employee-owned, results-driven, with a passion of transforming environments and the Quad Cities region through high-performance design as well as infrastructure. And now a message from our co-presenting sponsor, which is IMEG. And when we come back, you'll be able to hear Quad City Chamber President and CEO Paul Rumler. I know what you're thinking, but still, come back anyhow. What does that mean?
Good morning, I'm Paul Rumler, President and CEO for the Quad Cities Chamber. I'd like to thank Jim Mertens for all he does for us, and also like to thank our presenting sponsors, IMEG and MediaCom Business. Excuse me, I have a little cough in my throat. So at the Quad Cities Chamber, we believe in creating a prosperous regional economy where all can thrive. We do that by focusing on business growth, GDP growth, talent growth, and also by serving more businesses in our 6-county region. It's really exciting to be in June of 2021. It's been a long year. I know we've had so many challenges, but as I talk to you, you're all focused on the opportunities that lie ahead. And at the Quad Cities Chamber, we have a really important role in placemaking. It's really about investing in our community and making sure it's an attractive place that people want to call home. And this summer, we have a lot of events coming back in the Quad Cities, and it's what makes us who we are. And so we're really looking forward to seeing you. So take some time, get out and enjoy the Quad Cities area, and fill that void that was left by the pandemic. We have great optimism in the business community. As I talk to each and every one of you, I hear that you are dusting off projects that might have been put on hold, and that business is up. And so we're seeing that same thing at the Quad Cities Chamber as our project volume is double what it was in 2019 and 2020. So things are really on the up and up. There's one big if and one big concern that's on just about every business's mind, and it's about workforce. It's how do you have the people that you need to perform and meet your customers' demands. And there's no one solution. I don't have the secret sauce. I can't tell you that there's one thing that you need to do, but there is something that I'd ask you to consider. It's to be creative. Think about what you've been doing and think about some other ways that you could go about your business. For example, we're connecting employers with ideas like apprenticeships and internships. So if you've ever considered that, no matter what industry you're in, there are programs that can help you. So contact us at the Chamber. We're also polishing off a new regional brand, so that way we can tell our story to the world. The Quad Cities region is an amazing place to be. I know we all share that in common, and we can't wait to get out there and tell people why they should invest in the Quad Cities region and help us win that race for economic prosperity. And so now I'm very excited to have Kevin Depew from RSM join us for our 2021 mid-year economic forecast. I'd like to extend a special thank you to RSM for making this opportunity possible. And first, let's hear from D Films, the crew that's staffing and helping present today's live stream.
Well, thank you, Mr. Rumler. Got to admit, I mean, it's really amazing that, as he said, the projects have doubled from 2019, 2020, but you can tell that the Chamber is still really ready to do and handle all of that extra work and make sure that they serve you, the clients, the important people here in the Quad Cities. I get the honor to introduce Kevin Depew, who is the Chief Economist, National Industry Analyst Leader at RSM. Emmy Award-winning writer and producer. Prior to joining RSM, he worked in economics for Bloomberg LP, where he helped create the Bloomberg Brief Economics newsletter. Worked for Dorsey, Wright & Associates, Payne Weber, and A.G. Edwards. His former roles include Chief Strategist, a Director of Research, Financial Markets Analyst, Portfolio Manager. He has done, I believe, virtually everything. Kevin attended St. John's College in Annapolis and graduated from the University of Kentucky with a BA in philosophy. In other words, he knows absolutely everything. What's interesting, though, is Kevin has just recently refused to shave. And so we think that you're, what, are you becoming a seafarer? It looks like you're a ship captain of some sort.
2020 with very limited access to grooming materials. So.
Well, we want to thank you for joining us,
and I got to tell you the truth. We said this at the beginning of the year. I'll say it again: is now the most important moment, really, to find out what you have to say as far as the future, because it seems to be robust, but still somewhat fragile.
Absolutely, absolutely, you're right. What I want to do is talk about some of the longer-term forces that are impacting our economy today. And I know that most of us have spent the last 16 months in varying degrees, if you're like me, between a little bit of panic, a little bit of uncertainty, a little bit of volatility around all of the things around the pandemic as they unfolded. Well, we finally are at that point where the light is at the end of the tunnel. We continue to make progress in defeating at least the virus, the way it impacts us in our daily lives, all those things that have prevented businesses from being fully reopened. And so we're going to talk about some of the key themes. The first one is the resilience. And I think if you go back to a year ago, it wasn't that we were extremely pessimistic. We just felt like that if we got to this point a year later, that we would have this kind of economy where we're really beginning to reopen. It would have been a little bit surprising, maybe 6-12 months ahead of what we had feared might be the worst case. So there's the resilience of the U.S. economy. There's the reopening that is taking place. And then along with that, there is a reimagining of everything from what is appropriate in terms of going to work. Do we need to be in the office for everything? What is the hybrid work from home, work in the office model look like? What is it going to require to be able to staff at levels where we need to be able to meet the demand? So we'll talk a little bit about these themes. They'll recur throughout the program. And once we get to the comments section from you at the end, that's where if you have comments or questions, I'd like to hear your perspectives on what's happening too, since you're in the middle of it there in the Quad Cities. It's true that this year we will get the best growth that we've seen since the 1980s. So I know for many of you, especially if you're younger than me, then that's 2 lifetimes ago. And most of us, if you are, say, in your 30s or 40s in your career, you just have not had it. It's been 25 years since we've been anything that resembles what we would characterize as a longer-term normalized economy. So meaning you've experienced the dot-com crash. You've experienced the corporate debt bubble that made the dot-com crash even worse. You experienced the great financial crisis, the Great Recession, the worst recession since the Great Depression. And then we've now experienced a 100-year, once in a 100-year, hopefully, pandemic that we're trying to emerge from. So the economy looks much different. And one of the themes that we'll keep coming back to in terms of reimagining what the future economy looks like is a lot of the technological innovation that has laid the groundwork beginning in the early 90s, continuing through the dot-com era. All of that technological innovation has made the past year as resilient, the opportunity to be as resilient as we could be. So we have a tremendous, I don't want to say backlog, but a tremendous foundation of technological innovation that has made all of these things possible. Now we'll come back to that because I think that's going to be very important for what the next 5-10 years looks like. The economy, in terms of healing, will likely generate about 7.5 million jobs this year. A lot of work to do there, and there's the composition issues within the labor force that makes it challenging. Even though we're going to generate so many more jobs this year, we still have some problems in the labor market. We have problems on the supply side, which you are feeling on the business side, and then we have problems on the demand side, particularly for those who are not qualified for some of the jobs that are available. And you add all of this in, the real opportunity that we have is the modernization of the aging U.S. infrastructure. And so those are going to be the key themes that recur throughout this presentation. Now, in terms of the recovery and expansion, one of the reasons demand is so strong right now is that we've essentially accumulated $4 trillion in excess savings compared with pre-pandemic levels. So it's not that opportunities were so great to save. It's more along the lines of, well, we had a pandemic that really removed almost all opportunities at certain points to be able to spend any money. So those of us who worked throughout the pandemic, we naturally accumulated some savings, or in other cases where that wasn't possible, you paid down debt and reduced some of the debt load that you had. All of those things are positive and are leading to this explosion in demand as the economy reopens. That's characterized by all the things that make this event possible: technology, telework, automation. The major risk of the outlook is that we have another fourth wave of the pandemic, something that may have been unforeseen. For example, some of the new variants. Fortunately, to date, what we know is that the vaccines do work against the new, more easily transmissible variants. So that's good news. Otherwise, we continue to have a high degree of polarization in the United States, and I would say globally. It's not just in the U.S. You have essentially a K-shaped economy where technology, telework, automation, all the people who were employed in those areas or in areas that utilize those aspects of productivity, that you essentially operated with some major inconveniences, but it wasn't the same as the Great Recession when business demand just collapsed. So it's a much different economy, much different recovery. Along with that K-shaped environment where you have people who kind of went through the pandemic as if, it was a major inconvenience and nothing more, you have those who were frontline facing workers who were involved in dealing with the public face-to-face, healthcare workers, frontline workers in all of those emergency and rescue, fire, police. But you have a different wage environment for those groups than you do for those who are engaged in the technology, telework, and automation. All of that goes to produce some of the social tensions that we're seeing. The potential for political violence continues to be there. We remain a very polarized, very politically polarized. And in Iowa, you've certainly seen that firsthand over the last 8 years, 12 years, and how it's steadily increased, from 16 years ago. So a lot of that has to do with some of the economic forces at work, and we'll take a look at some of those too, and what's a path toward reducing some of that social tension and political tension longer term. Now, in terms of the hard data that we can anticipate for our forecast, we think that this first quarter is going to come in, when all is said and done, at 6.4%, jumping up to 10.7% in Q2, 8.3% in Q3 before it moderates a little bit in Q4, as is typically the case, 5.8%. So that gives us a full, if you calculate all those together, a full year 2021 growth rate of 7.5%. Again, you have to go back to the early 80s for anything that approximates that level of GDP growth. Now, in fairness, a lot of that is the pent-up demand that's coming in all at once, it feels like. And so from a business standpoint, it's very challenging because you recognize that, if you have supply chain issues or if you have staffing issues, then you're not really able to meet the demand that's coming into the marketplace. And so that's frustrating on top of what's been a 16-month-long frustrating period of curtailed economic activity, and I understand that. The good news is that even when we get into 2022, that will moderate, but still at 4.8%, and then longer out to 2023, we're still forecasting 2.9%. And I want to put that 2.9% in perspective. From 1947 to present, the long-term growth path of the United States economy is about 1.8, 1.9%. So anything above that is very solid economic growth. So even though we're going to moderate from this pent-up demand that comes out or is coming into the marketplace right now, we're still going to be running and growing at levels that are much higher than we have seen over the last 10 years, certainly since the Great Recession. And the potential for a sustained GDP growth environment that looks much more like the 90s. So not at all like the fits and starts where we had a lot of obstacles to growth. So if it wasn't just the dot-com crash and the corporate debt bubble unwinding, then after that, it was households that became too over-leveraged to housing, businesses that were too over-leveraged to the financial sector, all of those things which provided structural obstacles to growth in the decades since the Great Recession. So in terms of policy, and one of the key changes that we've seen over the last couple of years, going back to the early 90s when I started my career on Wall Street. So at that point, early 90s, if you wanted to understand what was happening in the economy, you needed to understand what was happening in Wall Street. Essentially, what was happening in D.C. was a long period, essentially 30 years of deregulation, moving away from some of the policies of the 60s and 70s, some of the activist fiscal policies, which impacted the economy at a very great level, to a Wall Street and a financial-driven economy, one where if you If you knew anything about economic growth or wanted to know anything about it, you needed to follow people like Alan Greenspan. You needed to see what was happening with the big Wall Street banks. You needed to see what was happening in hedge funds and private equity. Well, now we're in a period that looks a lot more like the 60s and 70s. The policy outlook, the main component of this is going to be infrastructure. If we go back 4 years, we estimated that at around 2017, last time we did a major study about U.S. infrastructure, we estimated that there was about a $3 trillion deficit. And that was largely concentrated in areas like what you typically think of as infrastructure, right? So the roads, bridges, ports, tunnels, the transportation systems that make for the easy transport of goods across a very large country and throughout the North American ecosystem. So from Canada to U.S. and our important trading partners there and Mexico as well. So you go from having some, what was essentially the Eisenhower creation of the U.S. interstate system, the largest infrastructure proposal in U.S. history, to a long period where we really didn't do a lot. We did some on a localized or regionalized level. So if you think about areas like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., where when I lived in D.C. in the early 90s, you didn't think it was ever going to be finished with some of the easing of traffic congestion and infrastructure that was taking place there. The things that are more non-traditional, and the reason for these non-traditional things. So modernizing the electric grid. You see what happens if somebody hacks in to something like a gas pipeline that shuts down gas deliveries to the East Coast for 5 or 6 days, creating tremendous impairment in economic activity. So that's not even a large scale. You can imagine or think about what would have happened if that had been on the West Coast instead, where that area of the country is much more dependent on getting to places with automobiles and using gasoline. To things like expanding broadband access. And that goes a long way toward remedying what we had seen over the last decade, which was the accrual of economic gains disproportionately in large MSAs and leaving behind a lot of rural America. So if you go back to that notion that we've become a more polarized society with a K-shaped economy, then that was made worse by the fact that all of that economic gain, most of those economic gains, were accruing to cities versus rural areas. So how do you re-incentivize businesses to move into areas that they may have forgotten about over the last 20 years? Well, one way is by expanding broadband access. So all of these things aren't traditional infrastructure proposals, the big ticket items, retraining the workforce for the economy of the future, but they're critical because essentially the modes of production in the economy have changed. So if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, you wouldn't have continued with fiscal policy that was Industrial Revolution based or pre-Industrial Revolution based. You had to adjust for what were new modes of production, which enabled increased productivity. So we're in that period now where it requires investment in what has long been non-traditional infrastructure. Those are the things that are going to make us a competitive economy in the global scale for 20, 25, 30 years from now. Now, in terms of trading global growth, we do see some of the cosmetic mending offenses with major trading partners. And, you know, that's not going to really move the needle. We still have the tariffs in place with China. We still have softwood lumber tariffs that are creating additional headwinds for the housing market in the United States. We have all of these issues that continue to, all these frictions that continue to be there, but you're likely to see not new frictions introduced. And so that's going to be important in maintaining what is an above trend level of economic growth for the next 4 to 10 years. While you know, we have seen some adjustment of tariffs with the UK, those will likely continue. You will continue to see the North American trade routes experience a very robust recovery. All of this, you know, it really gets lumped in sometimes with the disruptions that we continue to see in global supply chains. All of those things are creating challenges for us to be able to bring in supplies that we need to be able to meet demand. Those will eventually resolve themselves, not as quickly as we'd like, but even on the semiconductor side. You know, and look, you can't set up a semiconductor fabrication factory in a matter of 6 months, probably not even in the matter of 9 or 12 months. But eventually we will start to see some moderation in some of the demand there for semiconductor chips. So even in the areas that are most stressed by this supply chain disruptions today, you'll still see those start to moderate as we get through this recovery. So we talked about it being a K-shaped recovery, but it's really a K-shaped economy. When you go back and you start to look at wage patterns for the last 20 to 30 years, you see that those people with advanced degrees, so-called knowledge workers, I think there's sometimes people refer to them as symbolic analysts, people who work with large data sets or they work with words, communications, things like this, that their fate in the economy has been much better than those who are hourly workers. A couple of things have been drivers of that over the last 30 years. Some of it was demographic driven, especially at entry-level jobs, beginning around 2000 when you saw millennials, the largest demographic force since the baby boomers, began to fully enter the workforce. All of that created downward pressure on wages. Well, now we have a different demographic environment. All the millennials are in the workforce. They're not waiting on the sidelines. There's not another large cohort of labor supply ready to re-enter the workforce. And this is going to create longer-term headwinds for staffing. It's just not going to be resolved in the next 6 months. It's not going to be resolved in the next 5 years. And so part of that means that we'll see a continuation of this K-shaped economy until we get to a point where we start to be able to meet the skills mismatch through training that we have between the jobs that are available and the people that are available to take jobs. There's just a mismatch there along with the demographic challenge. Some of the areas that will continue to lead, tech, life sciences, obviously, housing, auto manufacturing continue to be very bright spots. The middle market is very solid, and because that accounts for about a third of all employment in the United States, about 25% of GDP, that's critical to the structure of the economy going forward. And so as part of that reimagining process, we'll start to rethink how we deliver services. We'll start to see automation and the rollout of 5G radically change the number and types of services that can be delivered at a distance, meaning healthcare, all of those types of things that we may not have even considered as being a service that can be delivered via long distance. But once we start to catch up from an infrastructure standpoint, that reimagination of services, the re-envisioning of what commercial real estate, of what retail physical spaces look like, will all be part of things that are in the conversation for the next decade or so. Now, in terms of the middle market specifically, what we're looking at here is our middle market business index. And you can see the very resilient and robust recovery that we've had in the middle market. We're essentially in those ranges already from where we were pre-pandemic. So, it's been a challenging, if you just look at the chart here, you can see that period between when we went to monthly in the pandemic from quarterly, from about July, August of this time last year, the fits and starts that we had in trying to regain some of the middle market optimism around the economy. Well, that started to unlock, and we did have some moderation recently, but when we dig into the subcomponents of this index, those are largely around the supply chain disruptions, inability to find workers, and some of the near-term headaches, prices paid for goods, for example, that businesses are dealing with. So it's not like those are going to go away overnight, but they will start to recede, everything except the labor, and we'll come back to that. So when we think about how this economy is recovering, one of the challenges is that we all have our recency bias, and that's just the fancy behavioral economist way of saying that we tend to overweight things that happened more recently and assume that the next thing like that happens will be like the last one. And so you can see in terms, how this plays out in terms of GDP. And what I would look at here is the green line going up. That's the what we call the potential GDP, and that tends to be fairly smooth, long-term upward line, right? And you can see that the real GDP in the black line, how far below that line we fell and how long it took for GDP to recover back to levels that were meeting potential. So it essentially took it until about 2017. Meanwhile, we had full employment around that time on top of it. So, again, here we get hit with the worst pandemic in 100 years, something that completely changed the business environment overnight. And then the feeling was, okay, well, maybe it's going to take a long time to emerge from this, and maybe this recession and the recovery will look like the last one. Well, it doesn't look like that in any shape or form at all, right? So if you think about where we were structurally prior to the Great Recession, we had, again, households over-leveraged, too much debt, too much consumer debt, too much housing debt. The general economy, the real economy, over-leveraged to the financial economy, over-leveraged to housing, and all of those structural forces took a long time. So you can essentially think about that time period of recovery as being a period of households repairing their balance sheets, trying to get to a place where they could engage in economic activity that was a little more, that was probably more stable than what it was around 2006, 2007. You know, we all knew that that was unsustainable longer term, but that's part of the herding behavior where we just can't help ourselves, right? Some of us may have ended up with 2 homes or 3 homes when we knew that, well, we have no business having 2 homes, but here we are. So all those forces have gone to create a much more risk-averse economy, but one that's going to be stable longer term, and that also limits the downside for the next recession, the one after the pandemic recession, limits the downside and creates the conditions for a much more stable, longer term, less volatile business environment. A couple of caveats to that, mostly around technology and some of the forces there. But just in general, you're not going to get a 10-year recovery from this. You're probably going to be fully recovered by the time we get to July or August in terms of the data when we go back and look at it in hindsight. Still some areas of stress. This is probably the easiest way to show that is the weekly initial jobless claims. We did have a bump up slightly last week, but it was mostly just noise. We continue to see improvement. Initial claims last week of 412,000 on a weekly basis. We've gone a long way from running at around, you can see at one point earlier this year, we were about 600 and some thousand 4-week moving average for initial claims. We've moderated down now to below 400,000. So getting close to that pre-crisis level of 210,000, which is about normal for the economy. So we are seeing improvement here, but it's going to take a long time. We have so many people who are simply not qualified for jobs that we need them to do. And so that's some of that skills mismatch. So it looks like there's a large pool of available labor, but when you start to cast around for it, what you find, and you may have seen this on the business side, is you get people who maybe they've been out of the workforce for so long that you're like, I don't know, do I really want to spend, a couple of weeks trying to catch them up? I need people who can come in right now and run our technology right now. I don't have the luxury of waiting 2-3 weeks. Plus, you have on top of that feeling about, well, I don't know, is this spike in demand something that's going to be persistent, or is it just going to last throughout the summer and then people get worried about flu season, another wave of the pandemic? Are we going to go back to something that's a little more damp? So all those challenges around hiring right now, and we certainly understand that. Another way of looking at some of the K-shaped recovery and some of the improvements is the low-paying service sector hiring. So these were the folks that were last to be able to re-enter the workforce, mostly because they were in occupations that continued to have business curtailment. So New York City, where I'm based, only recently in the last couple of days went to full-service dining indoors that had been capped around 50% for most of the past 4 months or so after being raised from 25%. So you have these people starting to come back into those food service and drinking places, leisure and hospitality areas that have been fully shut. And so people are returning to work, but just not at levels where we need because of the demand that's so pent up. Looking at that savings to give you a visualization of what that looks like. And I think this one also goes to why this recession or why the next recession is not going to be like the Great Recession. So if you look at that red line, that's the pre-pandemic average household savings and it goes back, you can see that we spent a good 10 years, really going back to the late 90s, below the 20-year average in terms of average household savings. So what does that mean? That means throughout that 10-year period, households were drawing down savings. So in some cases, they may have been taking money out of defined contribution plans. They may have been taking money out of IRAs. They may have been taking money out of household and various investments that were counted as savings and using those for consumption. So then we get hit with the Great Recession, the worst recession since the Great Depression. And then what happens with household savings? Well, you have a long period even before we got to the pandemic, were household savings running well above that 20-year average. So what that means is households have become much more risk averse after the Great Recession, much less likely to take on too much debt, just lower consumption of goods overall, tilted more toward experiences, but at a more modest and reasonable level. And so then when you factor in the pandemic, the forced savings on top of that, well, this is the amount of money that's going back into the economy even as I speak. The idea that this is going to return to that long 10-year period of below trend savings fueling consumption, unlikely to happen in the near term. So what that means is that we have the conditions for a much more stable and robust household sector when the next recession does hit. It could be because inflation rises. It could be because of a geopolitical conflict. It could be because of a variety of reasons that we couldn't foresee. But what we do know is that it's going to be more muted, less of a reason to worry about anything that like we were worried about in 2007, 2006. So that raises the question, well, okay, what about inflation? We are seeing that already. I didn't update this from the most recent data, but you can know that the CPI rose from 4.2% to 5%. And so the CPI, the headline inflation rate there, is the one that gets reported in the newspapers, right? So you saw that 5%. You felt it before then. If you were buying gas, you've seen gas prices go up. If you were buying groceries, you've seen various groceries go up. On the labor supply, you may have seen your low-wage workers demand more on an hourly basis. The Fed is focused on so-called core, which strips out the volatile food and energy components. That's still running at 3%, well above any level that we've seen over the last 15 years. So is this longer-term inflation? Well, let's think a little bit through this. So this is the Middle Market Business Index, and I'll give you just a quick rundown of what this means. The green line there is the bold line there, 69% in the most recent survey, says that this month versus last month, businesses paid much more for goods and services, not even counting labor. And the dashed line, if you're asking them 6 months ahead what they're anticipating, 8 out of 10, more than 8 out of 10 are saying they anticipate paying more for goods and services 6 months from now. And the blue lines there are those who anticipate paying less, and then 6 months ahead in the dashed line or the dotted line there for those. So you can see that the inflation that businesses are dealing with, even if it is only temporary, is real. So when the Federal Reserve or Jerome Powell talks about inflation being transitory, they're talking about policy level inflation. And that's very important to understand, and we'll take a closer look at that. When you look at the most recent, and this one is the most recent May data, where is the rise in prices being felt most acutely? Well, fuel oil. So we're going to strip that out of core, right? Because we don't want to adjust short-term interest rates or Federal Reserve policy based on whether fuel oil is going up or down. And then transportation. Well, we know the transportation and the logistics problems there, everything from shipping globally to shipping domestically, transportation costs, those are related to the supply chain disruptions that we know will recede over time. So we don't want to adjust central bank policy based on transportation prices rising. Used vehicles up 7.3%, accounted for a full third of that 5% increase in CPI. So do we, how many times are we going to buy a used vehicle? Once every couple of years? So are we going to adjust Fed policy for used vehicle prices going up? No. And then you see some of the other categories there: information technology, rent of shelter, lodging away from home, all those areas that we will likely see some very modest increases over time as demand comes in, but none of these are areas where we would want to adjust central bank policy. So I think you get a lot of media commentary about the Fed's asleep at the wheel, they're behind the curve, they're doing the wrong thing, they're letting inflation run rampant. Well, look, when you look at the data, it doesn't show that. So we're very confident the Fed's doing a good job of navigating this transitory inflation environment. And when we look at inflation on a longer term scale, going back, about 100 years, what we see is that we've been in a very, very long period of muted inflation driven by a couple of things. One is labor enabling technology. So if you think about all of the things that make this event possible, which even 10 years, this would have been a tremendous challenge to try to pull off a virtual event. Now we do it like it's no big deal. Labor enabling technology. You think about your smartphone. Essentially, a smartphone is about a $700 to $1,000 device or somewhere thereabouts if you're with the big brand name producers of those. That essentially is a full office that would have cost about $5,000, $6,000, maybe $7,000 to equip as recently as 10, 15 years ago. So all of those enabling types of technology produce very low and disinflation pressures longer term. You add combined on top of that the internet, which allowed for the easy distribution and dissemination of information and data. So what does that mean? That means that's a disinflationary event. It makes the easy reproduction of everything cause prices to collapse to near zero. So you have even things about the ease of production of apparel. In the 70s and 80s, when there was, you see those spikes there in inflation and stagflation. When my mother went to buy jeans, we either bought the Levi's for $30 or we bought the Wrangler or Lee's for $25. Those were the three choices. Now you've got hundreds of kinds. So it's easy to substitute for anything that rises in price. All those things act to put a damper on structural inflation, the kind that rises to the policy level. So how do we get to a point where we would have maybe an inflation event that means the Fed is behind the curve? Well, you would need some kind of pent-up demand and a quick, what we refer to as demand pull inflation in the economics textbooks. Well, we have that because we have the vaccine distribution that's allowed for a return to normal pre-pandemic spending patterns. We have that near $4 trillion in forced savings, the economic impairment, that pent-up demand. So, okay, we can check that box. That's our demand pull inflation. We also need cost push, right? So we need labor challenges, production bottlenecks, supply chain disruptions. We got those. So that's the cost push, right? And you have to have businesses with some pricing power to be able to offset that excessive demand. So we can check that box too. Then we need the Fed to be accommodative in policy and to tolerate above their 2% inflation target for a fairly long period of time. Okay, we got that. So why is this not 70s, 80s? Well, we talked about the technology disinflationary pressures. You also need the core component of the 60s and 70s that's missing. And that's fiscal policy that is very activist in nature, that is offsetting demand shortfalls. And so there is some thought that maybe we have that. We have this, what has at one point been a near $3 trillion infrastructure proposal. Now the GOP and the bipartisan GOP Democrat-led 12-person infrastructure proposal rising to a little bit above $1 trillion. All this demand, or all of this, that's spending, that's going to count, right? Yeah, no, it's just not anything like what we saw in the 60s and 70s. And I think this gives a better picture. You know, we talked about the polarization. So this is a look at the composition of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. And so if you look at where we were throughout the 50s and 70s period, and I'm not blaming this on one party or another, it's just a reality that you had a significant majority party control that allowed for fiscal policy to be passed with relative ease. It took a long time for the, if you think about the Eisenhower infrastructure bill, probably the most popular president in the last 60 years. Bipartisan support, former war hero. It took him 18 months to be able to get that infrastructure bill passed, even though everybody was behind it and everybody needed it. It's going to take a long time to get this one passed. So even if we do pass it, it's going to be very modest. And you simply don't have, even on a tax level, the ability to push through the kind of fiscal policy that truly changes the landscape of what we're going to be dealing with. So I think that is the reason that we're not in the camp that you see some of the macroeconomic pundits, whether it's Ray Dalio or Paul Tudor Jones, you know, the old guard coming out saying, it looks a lot like the 60s and 70s. But when I look at the composition, I just think in terms of fiscal policy, it's not there. It doesn't mean it's not going to transition there. And I think longer term, if you look at where the millennials tend to fall in terms of tax fairness, wealth inequality, income inequality, that it's probably likely that over the next 25 years, we move more in a direction towards something that begins to look a little more activist, but it's not going to happen in the next couple of years. And it probably won't happen with whoever the next administration is. Those are longer term forces. It's going to take a long time for us to get there. So meanwhile, we do have some issues in terms of frothiness, and I think that's fair to point out. This is financial conditions, and this is essentially presented as a Z-score. So that's the fancy economist way of saying that below the red line zero there, financial conditions are accommodated. Below the red line, they're restricted. And so you can see those periods where, most recently the recovery from the Great Recession, when we were very restricted, largely because we didn't have the kind of monetary and fiscal policy working together to be able to meet the challenges of that recession. What did the Fed and fiscal policymakers learn, as polarized as fiscal policymakers are today? Well, in a matter of 8 weeks in the spring of last year, you had not only the Fed empty out virtually all of the toolbox that they utilized over the course of 2 or 3 years in the Great Recession recovery, but you had fiscal policymakers overcome extreme polarization to really step up and try to make the pandemic something that households were able to get through with relative ease. And I think that deserves credit. I don't think that that's something to poke holes at and to say, well, that's indicative of the kind of fiscal wherewithal or fiscal profligacy that we're going to see going forward. I think that was a moment of crisis, and fiscal policymakers on both sides of the aisle stepped up to meet it. What that did mean, though, is that we're in a period of fiscal conditions that are extremely accommodated. This is historically the highest level of accommodation we've seen in the history of this chart. And so, that is going to ease. That will put some downward pressure on financial markets. I don't think that translates into anything that remotely resembles what we saw in 2008 or 2009, or even really the period of financial volatility that we saw around everything from the European sovereign debt crisis or Brexit and those types of things. It just means that we're going to be in for a period of relatively weak gains going forward for equities. And again, going back to this continually comes up, we did spend a lot of money on the pandemic, right? And this chart shows it. Public debt as a percentage of GDP, all-time high going back to even World War II. And you can see various points there in the 80s and 90s when people were very much worried about public debt as a percent of GDP. And then the spend in the Great Recession, which really limited what policymakers were doing around the recovery from the housing overhang. Even then, with that large move upward in spending, it took a long time to recover from that recession because of the structural components. Well, in order to have inflation, you need to have velocity of money increase. And so most of the people who talk about public debt as a percent of GDP being at crisis levels, they, for some reason, ignore this chart. And this is the velocity of money, which means basically how quickly a dollar in my hand exchanges into other hands throughout the mechanism of financial transmission in the economy. When this is very low, as it is now, and you can see the sharp decline there from as a result of the pandemic, and the very non-existent recovery that we've seen yet in velocity of money, why has this been going down for the past 25 years? Well, this has to do with household risk aversion. You can see parts of this where it started to increase around 2000, which is not surprising. You can see where this velocity of money began to rapidly increase in 2006, 2007, when housing turnover in the economy was very high and leverage was becoming very extreme. And then, since that time, we've been in a steady downtrend, indicative of slower turnover of money in the economy, which itself means higher savings, less risk tolerance, so more risk aversion. So that's essentially the story of this chart. You can't have inflation without having extremely high risk tolerance. If you look at another way of envisioning whether we are in trouble as debt as a percent of GDP, well, this is a look in the black line again, that public debt as a percent of GDP. But in the green line, going back to the 50s, this is our net government interest payments. So if you think about this on the household side, for example, what's most important in determining whether you can afford a home? Well, it's the combination of the money that you put up front and the monthly payment, right? So it's all about the monthly payment. Are you able to meet the payments? Are you able to have a consistent flow of income that will allow you to meet those mortgage payments? This is very similar. It's not identical apples to apples comparison, but this is where we are in terms of net government interest payments. So historically low, even with the enormous spend. So this is how you can have this kind of significant fiscal spend in the economy to help households get through and businesses get through the pandemic without stoking the kind of inflation that some of the macro pundits of the world like to talk about. In addition, I would note that it's not just the U.S. that's doing this. If it were the U.S. alone, well, that's when you start to worry a little bit. Why is the U.S. spending so much money? Is that sustainable? You had a similar scenario unfold in Japan, for example, in the 80s. So, well, it's not just the U.S. It's Canada, it's the UK, it's the EU, it's Japan, it's China. So it's not the central bank or fiscal policymakers in the U.S. acting alone. The decision was made globally to spend money to help households and businesses get through the pandemic. And so far, that decision is looking like the correct one, especially when you look at it in the context of what those net interest payments are going to be. So I want to move quickly to the comment section from you. And so just mention a couple of things that can go right. You may have noticed that not a lot of these things have changed from the last time that you were there when we spoke. But I put in green the ones that are positive themes, in red the ones that are headwinds, and TBD the ones that are to be determined. And I want to focus on the third category there, the positive risks of the economic outlook, things that are to be determined that are the longer term forces. Well, the key one that we're facing now, and I saw an op-ed about this morning, and I believe it's in the New York Times, where economists were talking about the advent of labor-enabling innovation. And I have to say that I completely disagree with that. I think we've been in a 30-year period where we've had technology, labor-enabling technology innovations, lay the groundwork for all of this. And so what we're concerned about is the rapid pull forward of labor replacing technology, driven by not only the experience of the pandemic, the need to protect our frontline workers, the need to probably accept the fact that these types of viruses are going to be more frequent, require periods where we do have some kind of business curtailment, probably a period where we look at, well, you know, maybe the amount of money that we've kind of foregone, which is in the hundreds of billions of dollars just because of seasonal flu, that we'll need to rethink some of that. All of that pulls forward additional labor replacing technology. And what that means is that we're doing more increasing productivity with fewer workers. So businesses that are having a hard time hiring workers now, this is what you have to think about. There's not a pool of labor waiting to go into the market to be able to solve your labor needs. Even if there's another recession on the back of this one, if unemployment rises to 6.8, 7.8, 8.8%, that doesn't mean that you're going to have an additional pool of workers to pull from. They're not going to be qualified for most of the jobs that are available. So that's a key headwind longer term, and it requires a policy challenge in the terms of infrastructure, training the workforce of the future. It also poses some challenge for us in terms of that K-shaped economy. And what do we want wealth to look like in the U.S.? What do we want income to look like in the U.S.? Those are the two longer-term forces that are going to define the experience of millennials, much in the same way that some of the policies around 70s and the 80s defined the way baby boomers approached policymaking as they age out of those policymaking roles. So I'm going to stop sharing there and go back to you, Jem, and hopefully we have some comments that I can learn a bit from.
But I mean, one of the things that you were pointing out is that, I mean, we're really in a roaring economy. I mean, the GDP being up, you know, substantially right now. Like you said, 10.7% for the second quarter, perhaps more than 7% for the entire year. Does that translate as well to the Midwest? I mean, sometimes you think that the Midwest might be a little slower, where the flyover area might be a little slower than other areas. Is that how you see the Midwest and perhaps even a rural agricultural state such as Iowa or Illinois?
You know, I'm actually really optimistic about that. And I'll note one challenge for the Midwest is attracting new residents, increasing or changing your demographics. The rural areas and Midwest specifically is disproportionately an aging population versus major cities. Now, the pandemic and some of the move away from high cost of living areas like San Francisco, like New York, like Chicago, into more rural areas is a positive longer-term force. But you don't have the demographics to meet your labor challenges. Now, in terms of growth, it's likely that the Midwest specifically, we're at about 6% for the Quad Cities for 2021. So that's obviously a little bit below at our 7.5% forecast for national GDP. And then it's going to become a little bit more challenging still because of the inability to meet the labor supply challenges. So I think what I would be concerned about, and I think that Paul talked about this on the top of the webcast in terms of what the chamber activities are those things that you can do, new innovative ways to think about how businesses get the labor that they need. And then other innovative ways that go to how you essentially restock the demographic pool and create a younger population. Before the pandemic, I was in Lincoln, Nebraska, and the head of the State Chamber of Commerce there showed a fascinating chart that showed that in their public K through 12 enrollment, it was unchanged since the 1980s. Unchanged. So you think about that 40-year period, and you have the same enrollment in K through 12 today as you did in 1982. That's a problem. And that's a longer-term problem that requires some new thinking to be able to attract people there. The good news is I think that non-traditional infrastructure, rolling out broadband, those are the things that help meet that challenge. They re-incentivize businesses to move away from those high cost of living, high cost of business areas like your major MSAs and explore moving into more rural, more Midwestern type of areas, kind of like where I grew up. Now, I've compared this to what it looks like in Kentucky. It was a small town 30 minutes outside of Lexington, which is the second largest town in Kentucky. And so we were a straight up, it was a blue collar industry town that was mostly around Jockey and Whirlpool. Well, in the 80s, when globalization started to mean that you could manufacture those things in lower cost areas, you can see that at one point, I think we had 40, 50% job losses from those two factories. But they thought of ways to re-incentivize businesses to move into those areas, and you had a renaissance of different types of manufacturing. And that was actually led by Toyota, relocating to Georgetown. And so there were a lot of things that were accomplished, incentives that allowed Toyota to come in, heavily criticized at the time. I remember people had parades trying to prevent Toyota from coming into Kentucky. And then 2 years later, those were some of the best jobs available. And I went to high school with people who took those jobs. Some of them still work there. So those are the types of things I think need to happen to change that balance between the MSAs and the rural areas. And I think that it's actually, I could say in New York City, it's not great if you have a business here. We're still not fully open. But I think those of us who are 20-year residents here, I would welcome a return to something that looks a little bit more like the 90s or 2000s, and something that looks a little bit less like 2006 or 2019.
Well, for businesses in this area, small businesses as well as the larger ones are concerned. I mean, this is a recovery that is really, as you have pointed out, really based a lot in the American Recovery and the Rescue Plan, federal influx of money, as well as you said, the pent-up savings of Americans who are now spending right now. If you're a small business owner, that seems to be like something that you're going to see spent right now, but in the long term, all that's going to wane, all that's going to go away. How do you plan for that?
Yeah, here's the good news and bad news situation. Now, it's very challenging as a small business to be able to prepare right now for this pent-up demand and to be able to take advantage of it, just because you have the staffing issues. In many cases, you have inventory issues or supply chain issues. You can't get key materials. You have long delays if you're manufacturing products. These are the types of things that Deere talks about, for example, right? So not only do they have some of the supply chain disruptions, they have very low inventories, and so they have business challenges in the near term, trying to meet the demand, and then recognizing that, well, the demand may not be there on the other side in the same way. The good news is that there's going to be less volatility. So if you think about when it became apparent that the economy was really recovering around 2017, and I think you have to give credit to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in terms of some of that recovery. It didn't accomplish what it wanted to in terms of capital expenditures, but we'll leave that aside. You did see the improvement in lowering some of the velocity or some of the volatility for businesses there. So you can anticipate that going forward. It's going to be much more stable, but the headwinds around staffing, the headwinds around labor, the headwinds around compensation, all of those things are going to go to make margins more challenging for small businesses, and especially as you're in an environment that's competing against other firms that are relying on increased automation, for example, to be able to expand their margin at a time when those of us who are relying on human workers find it more challenging. Still, there's no easy answer to it. I think Paul indicated that there's no magic bullet solution for it. It's just that's just the cycle that we're in right now.
Well, and you're following this far more closely than I am, but the Fed is signaling perhaps an interest rate increase. I think they said there could be 2 of them by 2023. That would really filter down to every single person, every single business in this area. Is that the cooling of inflation that would be needed, that would make for a healthier economy?
Well, you remember that there are 2 things going on. So first of all, what financial markets are most worried about is the so-called tapering, which means the Fed stopping or slowing the asset purchases that they're currently engaged in, all of which are designed to keep interest rates very low. In terms of raising rates, I don't think that we're moving even when we get to 2023. And look, the Fed's never been right over the last 20 years about when they're going to start raising interest rates, right? If they are raising interest rates, it will be because the economy has improved to a degree that this low level of interest rates are no longer necessary. So I wouldn't look at the Fed raising interest rates as being something that indicates the end of something. Instead, to me, it indicates the beginning of the next phase of the recovery. And even when you look at equities and asset markets, the reality is that if you look at stocks over time, when the Fed begins raising interest rates, stocks get a little nervous, but then they go up throughout that raising interest rate cycle because the Fed is involved in meeting the demands of a very improving economy. Stocks go down when the Fed's lowering rates because the Fed is realizing that the economy is not performing well. Now, in terms of businesses, it means that you might see some cost of capital start to go up over time, but it's not going to be the shocking cost of capital increase that damps the recovery. So I wouldn't worry about the cost of capital right now, which would have an impact. Instead, I would be worried about where's the access to capital? What are lenders asking for? And what are alternative forms of lending that I might be able to take advantage of, whether it's private equity or whether it's other areas of lenders that are non-traditional. So all those are going to run a little bit higher than the standard cost of capital as it's quoted in the press. But I think that's what I would be focused on right now is the availability of that capital and what do I need to be able to do things like automate or expand my business at a time when the volatility is going to be damped and we can rely on some consistent demand being there.
You talked about some of the low-income earners, and you also think of the service industry, which has driven the economy in so many different ways. And for the Quad City economy, you think of the hospitality, the bars, the restaurants, the hotels, all those things, which suffered incredibly over the last 15 months. Are you seeing that perhaps once we get through this, and you were thinking that perhaps we'll be in full recovery mode by July and August, the midst of summer vacation time, do you see that is a healthy line as well as far as hospitality is concerned, those small businesses that feed off of tourism or even just the people who want to go out to eat?
Yeah, I think that environment is going to be robust, to put it mildly. And I think that the robust nature of that recovery in leisure and hospitality and entertainment traveling and entertainment dining, we can continue to see that increase at a very healthy clip. What's going to be challenged are leisure and hospitality or food and drinking and and hotel types of things that rely on business travel. I know that when we talk about business travel as a firm, it's unlikely that we'll ever go back to the type of business travel that defined really the 2010, the 2019 period. And that's been pretty consistently the messaging from all types of firms that are engaged in business travel. So, look, that's going to be a challenge. If you are a hotel chain and you're dependent on business travelers, you're going to have some different supply-demand metrics
play out versus it may be likely that that will enable us to spend more time in some of the leisure and hospitality things with family and friends that may have suffered as a result of that business travel.
Well, talking about the growth that you're seeing for the rest of the year, and we're not going to see you again for another 6 months. So we're going to test what you said now, come December and January. Then you can tell us what we're going to expect in the coming year. But how can a business best? You're almost trying to harness the recovery right now, and then ride the wave right now, but sustain it afterwards. And that seems to be the key logic and strategy as far as all businesses are concerned, especially in the Quad Cities and the Midwest, of course.
Yeah, I think that and this starts to get into the middle market specifically, which often has some of these small business problems, even and at the same time they have some of the large firm problems, right? And so for the middle market specifically, we're trying to encourage middle market businesses to look past this summer, past this fall, toward planning for a less volatile and more stable demand environment longer term. So rather than trying to take advantage of every single thing, you're just going to be frustrated. You're not going to have the supply or the inventory. You're not going to have the labor to be able to really take advantage. So if you can move away from being, I want to be opportunistic about this recovery, toward, I want to think more about what I feel like is going to be the demand environment 14, 18, 24 months from now. That's what I want to be preparing for. That's the one that if you are making your decisions now with that in mind, recognizing that it's not going to be that long, slow burn of a recovery from the Great Recession, recognizing that the threat of a new recession, wherever it materializes, will very likely be brief and in many industries not even noticeable. You want to prepare for that kind of lowered volatility and stability in your business. So we're not trying to get all of the chips off the table here. We're trying to get as many as we can. We don't want to leave stuff on the table unnecessarily. But we want to prepare for something that's much more stable, much more enduring, and for one that looks much more normalized over the long period than what we saw around 2006, 2007, or the Great Recession.
Well, I mean, normalizing and stability are two things we haven't heard of in the last 15 months. There'll be welcome signs, just the stability. And Kevin, we really appreciate it. Any last thoughts before we let you go off to your day?
Well, no, the only thing I would say is that, I think that when we all look back and think about some of the changes that are likely to persist after the pandemic, I would take with a grain of salt the things about no one's ever, look, we're going to do business travel. We might cut it by 20%. We're not going to work from home permanently. And I go back to the Spanish flu, and what emerged from that was a period of great advances in public health and healthcare. And I think that the legacy of this pandemic will be very similar, that what we look back in terms of healthcare and what we experience 5 years from now from healthcare delivery and healthcare costs, we might be in for some very optimistic changes, things that were unimaginable even 2 or 3 years ago.
Well, I've also heard that, you go back from the Spanish flu and you move on and it was the roaring 20s after that. So you do wonder, because you're an economist, but a historian as well in so many different ways, if that might repeat itself.
Yeah, I don't think the roaring 20s, and as a society, and as corporates, our balance sheets are much better than at any point households were in the 20s. And so I take those with a grain of salt. The only thing that's similar is that we've had a period of confinement, and now we're going to go back and we're going to be able to see each other and be around each other and probably maybe do this event in person soon. So I don't think that the similarities are accurate at all. It's not going to be a boom and a bust period. Yeah, equity prices will correct and moderate, but the business environment is going to be very robust, and I'm very optimistic about that.
Also have much greater government control of the economy than you had back in the 1920s, of course. Kevin, thank you so much. We really appreciate everything you told us, and it's food for thought, not only at the macro level, but also at the micro level for a person who's on Main Street, as well as a person who has to do some international trade. We really appreciate you joining us. Thanks again. And we want to thank, of course, our sponsors IMEG and MediaCom Business, and to all of today's sponsors who are shown on the screen who have made this event possible, and we really hope that it was a great event for you. Today's program was just one of the resources the Chamber provides to support businesses, so we thank you for your support and investment in what I refer to as your chamber, so make the most of it, because together we can create a prosperous regional economy where all can thrive. Thank you so much for joining this morning. Thanks to Kevin, of course, for all the information he gave, Paul Rumler for the leadership that he gives to the Chamber, and hopefully you get to have a wonderful Friday. Enjoy your 4th of July weekend, of course. Be safe. Make some money. Thanks for joining us.